Dee's hands itched. They itched so much that she was completely miserable, her palms red and irritated from scratching, her fingers puffed up like sausages. The ring she wore on her right hand had become so tight that it felt like her finger might turn purple and fall off. She'd bought the wide silver band with the aquamarine stone last year when she traded off her wedding set. The only way to ease the swelling was to run her hands under a stream of cold water. But when she got the itching on her hands under control, it would pop up somewhere else, on the inside of her thigh or between her toes, or even around her crotch right at the panty line where she couldn't even think about scratching in public without looking completely nasty. When an itching spell came on, it did so with an intensity and intrusiveness that demanded all of her attention, and she could feel the raw sharpness deep under her skin, nearly to her gut. Still, what caused it? Her mother, Glenn, thought it was the animals, but Dee was unconvinced. The dogs, Ralph and Mickey, were hers to begin with, and she'd never had a reaction to them before. The only thing different was they all lived with Gary now, Dee and Ralph and Mickey, and the other animals he kept. It could be those birds, Glenn said, or that old bobcat. You could be getting bit by mites or fleas or something and not even know it. Dee rarely touched the animals, and Gary was careful to keep them treated for parasites, so what the hell did Glenn know? It was probably a reaction to some chemical, she decided, and changed her soaps and shampoo, stopped wearing perfume, wiped down the interior of her car, the steering wheel, the leather seats, the radio, and the stick shift, anything that she touched. When that didn't work, she considered her job. Could it be all the paper? She hated touching paper, but there was no way to avoid it, it didn't assure you. Thing was, she'd been touching paper all her life and never had a problem like this. Maybe, though, it was something outside, like maybe she'd gotten into poison ivy out at Gary's place. His whole yard was a goddamn jungle. Gary liked things natural, and he let the yard grow unrestrained. He didn't believe in cutting back the weeds or putting down herbicide. I don't want the dogs walking around with all that poison and then sitting down and licking it off, he'd said. Or Bobby either. Bobby was his first love, a bobcat he claimed to have rescued on a camping trip, bringing her home and training her to use the litter box and sleep at the foot of his bed, where she slapped her fat paw, claws extended, over any leg or hand or foot that dared to stir beneath the sheets. Since moving in, Dee had learned to sleep in one motionless position, flat on her back with her arm resting above her head. Your damn yard gave me something, she told Gary, lying in his bed and digging her fingernails into her palms. The itching subsided when she and Gary made love, when all she felt were his hands and his mouth, the satisfying weight of his body. But once the excitement passed, the threat of the itch returned. If you cared anything about me, you'd get a lawnmower out there and cut some of that shit down. I bet it's crawling with poison ivy. If you'd got into poison ivy, you'd have bumps and blisters, not swelling, he yawned. I think this itching is psychosomatic. What? In your head. How could I imagine anything like this? She shoved her swollen hands in front of his face. Then maybe it's something you ate, he said, pushing her hand away. Maybe you're allergic to peanut butter. You don't eat meat, so I bet you've been eating too much peanut butter. Have you ever seen me eat peanut butter? I hate peanut butter. That's weird. Nobody hates peanut butter. He ran his index finger up the center of her spine. Half the world hates peanut butter. She reached behind her and slapped his hand away. The itching made her irritable, and she felt like punching him in the face. Hitting him would be a release, though she wasn't positive that he wouldn't hit her back. She looked at him as he lay there, his messy brown hair, the stubble of his beard. Gary was a tall, slender man, his body all bone and muscle. He was gentle with her and had never raised a fist or given her reason to fear him, yet there was something treacherous, unknown about him, and she was careful not to push. Half the world. You got statistical evidence for that? He asked. But Dee couldn't take it anymore. It felt like something was crawling on her, like seed ticks or baby spiders. She walked naked to the bathroom, turned the shower on cold, stepped in, and let the freezing water fall over her entire body. At first, she couldn't breathe. Her muscles clenched tight against the chill, but she made herself stay. If she could stand it a few more seconds, she knew the sensation would change. The itch stopped dead in its tracks. And right when she was about to give in and step out of the water, there it was. The cold not feeling like cold anymore at all, but something akin to warmth. She stood beneath the water, her hands raised up in front of the shower head, fingers spread out like a frog's until the itch had been frozen numb. She turned off the water and looked to see her hands were normal size again, the flesh revealing the bony outline of her knuckles. Her palms were speckled as an egg, white and purple, but the itch was gone. She rubbed her fingers over her face and down her neck, feeling the goosebumps that rose up from her skin. A few seconds more, and she'd be shaking with chills, but for the moment, she felt nothing at all, and she savored it. Gary and Dee were together all the time, at home and at work. Gary was her boss, and it was probably bad for the relationship to see each other 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but it was better than being on her own. She hadn't liked living alone, and it was a relief to have someone to share the expenses again. For the most part, it was fine working with him as long as he did his own thing and let her do the same. On the weekends, he often disappeared for hours, working out on his property before coming back to the house to make supper, occasionally lighting up a corncob pipe filled with weed. Dee used to smoke cigarettes back when she frequented the pickup bars with her friend Shelley, but weed made her gag. She preferred beer or a glass of sweet wine. Gary didn't care what she did. It made no difference to him. What did make a difference to him was how they dealt with Leighton, his partner at the insurance office. I don't want to make it a secret that we're a couple, he told Dee when they first started sleeping together, but I don't want to broadcast it either. Leighton's real funny about shit, even when it's not his business. Of course, Leighton had been gone from the office for most of the summer, at home recovering from a beating. No one really knew what had happened, except for what little Leighton remembered, that he'd been waiting for a customer in the dark parking lot of an apartment complex in Fayetteville when he was dragged from his car by 3 men who proceeded to wail on him with baseball bats. When he woke up in the hospital, his wife was there, but so was his father, looming behind her hunched shoulders, solid and imposing as a guard. He'd insisted that Leighton come home with him to recover. If there's more to all of this than just an accident, me and your mother will get to the bottom of it, his father announced at the hospital before he spread his hands out over Leighton's swollen head and began to pray. It wasn't the first time Leighton had been in trouble, and there was no point in arguing. After all, his father did hold the title to the business. He'd bought it for Leighton after he graduated. A wonder to everyone who knew him, hopeful it would provide the structure his wayward son needed. Leighton and Gary couldn't afford to lose Insure You and the cover it provided for the drugs, so Leighton had done as he was told. But now, Leighton was back at work and the office had changed. Gone were the warm, drawn-out afternoons when Gary and Dee entertained themselves by locking the doors and pulling the shades and doing it there in the middle of the office, the fluorescent lights humming above. They'd even returned to driving separate cars to work, though Dee hardly saw the point. Still, it was just as well, since Gary was often out running errands, and she hated the idea of being stranded alone with Leighton, who'd returned fat and slow and grumpy from his 6 weeks of recovery at his parents' hands. Gary had warned her too, but Leighton thought he might be responsible for the beating in the parking lot. That's crazy, though, she said. You guys are partners. You wouldn't do something like that. Of course I wouldn't. He smiled and looked at her in her eyes, held her chin in his hand. Not without a good reason, anyway. There were plenty of things Dee didn't understand about Insure You. What she did understand was that Gary and Leighton went way back to when they were new college students living away from home for the first time, smoking together the pot that Gary's father grew on the booby-trapped acres of their house in Gravett. She knew, too, there was money running through the books of Insure You that didn't come from selling insurance policies at all. They really did provide insurance, but only to those who couldn't get it anywhere else, to people with no choice but to pay the heavy fee. The clients were troublesome people. Dee thought they behaved like animals with cars, and it was only Gary who kept her there. When Gary was in charge, those 6 happy weeks, he conducted the business of Insure You with so much firmness and authority that she stopped her worrying altogether and instead enjoyed the privilege of being the love interest of such an intimidating man. And the money was good, too. Gary saw to that. He gave her a cash bonus every week, which he told her to put back for a rainy day. Dee wasn't a saver, but she did as he said and now had a nice sum of money drawing interest over at the Second Bank of Fayetteville. I need to do some adjustments today, Gary told her that morning after they'd let themselves into the office. He disappeared into the kitchenette in the back and returned with a Diet Coke for her and placed it on her desk, then wheeled her in her chair out to the center of the room. I might make it back for supper tonight, but I doubt it. He gave the chair a hard spin, and she squealed. Let's get you going real fast, he said, make you dizzy. She pulled her legs in, squeezing her knees up to her chest as the chair slowed to a stop. Her skirt gaped open, showing her panties. She had good legs, she knew, even without a tan, her thighs firm and mostly free of cellulite. Gary looked over at the glass front door, making sure no one was walking by, then kissed her on the mouth. When you get home tonight, go ahead and feed Bobby and the dogs. I'll take care of the birds, he said. And when Leighton gets in, tell him to call me on my cell. Can't you just leave him a note or something? Leave it where? His office is a shithole. You could call him. True. He wheeled her back to her desk. But I don't want to. It's part of our dynamic. What does that mean? He popped open the tab of her Diet Coke, licking the spray off his finger. It means you just do what I say, he said, bending down and kissing her on the forehead as though she were a child. You and Leighton both. Leighton never came in at the front of the office, but parked behind the strip mall where Insure You rented space and let himself in the rear door by the trash bin. Dee tried not to look at him when she heard the door open, though she could hear the rustle of a bag in his hands. Every morning, he brought with him a McDonald's bag filled with 12 biscuits. He ate each one, plain, no butter, no jelly, sometimes in a single bite. Where's that asshole Gary, he asked, a gush of hot air coming in behind him. Out, she said. Adjustments. What? I said adjustments. Anybody been in? Any new fuckheads looking for me? No, Leighton, she said, turning her head enough to be heard. In addition to being fat and ill-tempered, Leighton had returned to work paranoid. Each time the office door opened, bing bong, his head popped out from his little room. Turtle man, Dee thought every time she saw the bodiless head behind her, his office a giant shell. He'd barely spoken to her before the beating, but now, when a customer left, he stood in the back, interrogating her. Who was that? Did you check the ID? Why? Because I fucking need to know, that's why. I'm keeping a list. You're supposed to call Gary, she said. Catch him on his cell. Why the fuck can't he call me? Maybe he doesn't want to disturb you, you know? Fuck that shit, he said. She turned all the way around and faced the front door, hoping Turtle Man would shut up and disappear into his hole. Everything with him was fuck this, fuck that, fucker, fuck, fucked. It was silent, but when she glanced behind her to check that he was gone, Leighton was still there. She felt a prickle shoot up through her jaw like a needle in her ear and reached up and scratched it. He spoke. You and Gary are a thing now. What do you mean? You're together, right? I guess so. You guess so, he said. Fuck, that means yes. He slapped his hand against the wall. You're a happy little couple, just you and Gary, that fucker. Dee didn't know what to say. Was Leighton jealous? She couldn't ask him that. If he'd wanted her for himself, he never let on. But then maybe it wasn't about wanting her so much as wanting to control Gary. No one controlled Gary, though. Leighton had to know that. He turned and went out the door, slamming it behind him. By noon, Leighton had not returned, and so Dee locked up as she left for lunch. Her mother had emailed her earlier, asking to meet at Chili's. Glenn was a compulsive emailer, sending odd messages throughout the day that hardly made any sense. Dee wished her mother didn't have a computer. They'd stopped speaking for a time after Dee's divorce when Glenn laid on the guilt, though it was clear that she'd been more upset about the loss of property than the breaking of vows. What about that china? What about all that good stuff people bought you for the wedding? It was worth a fortune and you sold it at a garage sale. She claimed to want grandchildren, but that wasn't true. It was only something to say. Now Glenn had her own problems. Her second marriage to a man named Kenny was falling apart and Glenn was on her own again. She saw her mother's car in the Chili's parking lot and went inside where the electric blue lights blinded her against the darkness of the bar. Gary refused to go to Chili's. He had too many customers who worked in the kitchen. Mama, she touched her mother on the shoulder. From behind, her mother's slim arms and waist made her look like a young woman. It was her face that gave away her age, and somehow this took Dee by surprise every time she saw her. You made it, said Glenn. I was just sitting here playing with my phone. Let's get a table. It's sort of like the bar here. You don't drink. I'd sure like to start. Glenn laughed and pointed at the bottles behind the bar. What tastes like fruit? A daiquiri, said Dee. Get a strawberry daiquiri, they're sweet. Her mother confused her. How changed she was from the woman who'd raised her, who'd done everything for her husband and child, even preparing an entirely different supper for each of them, as if she were their servant. Why couldn't they all eat the same thing? It was ridiculous for a woman to live that way. But still, she should have stayed with Harold, Dee's father, as he'd at least given her some direction. Glenn was someone who needed to be held down, who had to be kept from flying apart. Glenn got her drink and ordered a barbecue chicken salad and sneered when Dee ordered a veggie burger. That's why you're so pale, she said. This not eating meat business. It's not that. I'm just not going to the tanning bed anymore. Gary said I looked green. Green? Like khaki, Dee said. He said you can get a skin infection from the beds. A fungus. That's true. That's totally true. She had also stopped frosting her hair and let it return to its natural shade, a dark blonde that Gary said was the color of honey. I just started going myself, Glenn said. I dream I'm on a beach. Well, you're just starting things left and right. I am, Glenn said. Dee could tell she didn't like the daiquiri. She wanted sweet, but not that sweet. If I can get this settlement through, I can get me some money, too. Divorce makes you broke. You know what I'm talking about. You could get a job. I might do that. But she wouldn't. When Glenn was young, she got her high school diploma and then promptly married Dee's father. She'd given birth to Dee less than a year later. The closest she'd come to a job was helping to stage the houses he built and sold. She'd been good at that, making a house look lived in when it was empty as a cave. The houses were poorly constructed, and Harold cut too many corners, a scheme that caught up with him in the end. Now he ran a paint store and lived by himself over in Mountain Home. What I need to do is get me a Gary, Lynn winked at her. I like him. She'd eaten all the chicken out of her salad, leaving the greens wilting in the bowl. Maybe you should slow down a little. You know I eat fast. I don't mean that, Dee said. I mean, just find something else to do with yourself. Men aren't everything, says the one who's never gone without. Lynn shot back. Like to see you try it. I know all about you. Dee's shoulders dropped as she felt the crush of the insult. She reminded herself to breathe and took in a deep swallow of air and pulled her shoulders back. The blood flushed from her face into her neck, her chest, her arms and legs, and then she felt a tingle, the beginnings of an itch in the center of her left hand. She curled her fingers down to the palm and began to scratch. I shouldn't have said that. Lynn smoothed out her skirt, purple satin of all things, the hem 3 full inches above her bare knee. No telling where she bought it. Probably someplace meant for teenagers. No, you shouldn't have. Her right hand scraped at the palm of her left. She had Benadryl in her purse, but it would make her sleepy, and she'd struggle to keep her eyes open for the rest of the day. I'm not your problem. I'm telling you, honey, you got an allergy, Glenn said. My neck used to turn beet red when I was young, and I never did figure out what set it off. The doctor said it was a reaction to something in my environment. I don't know what it is. She dug into her purse for the Benadryl. She swallowed a pill with a slurp of ice water, wrapping both her hands around the glass for comfort. Gary says it's in my head. You and Gary gonna get married? Maybe someday. Actually, Gary had never mentioned getting married, and neither had she. That'd be nice, said Glenn. Dee saw her mother squinting her eyes. As long as she could remember, Glenn had been sizing her up. She'd been a doting mother in the beginning, fussing over her, braiding her hair, and spraying down the loose strands, so she was the only girl in school who never had to pull her hair apart midday and do it up again. By junior high, Glenn had bought her a tool chest full of makeup and wouldn't let her leave the house without lip gloss, as though Dee was a kind of extension of herself. But soon, she was no longer an accessory to her mother, but a competitor. If she wore a short skirt, Glenn wore a shorter one. If she invested in golden highlights for her hair, Glenn went platinum. In some ways, they'd even competed for Harold, and Dee had grown up with a feeling of panic, which was only made worse by Harold's indifference. Had Glenn felt it too? In the end, he'd left them both, smashing up their last house with a sledgehammer, shattering the windows and mirrors in the porcelain toilets. He was so far in debt, he needed every penny he could get his hands on, but by the time he managed to sell the wrecked house, there was no profit to be had. In her heart, Dee blamed Glenn for all the troubles. She'd always believed her father to be a good man. Listen, Dee, I just want you to know that this divorce has put me in a bad spot. I don't want to ask you for nothing, but I might need to. I don't have nobody else. You need money now, or you just think you'll need it? Both, I guess. Kenny won't spot you anything. Glenn shook her head. The waitress had brought their bill and returned twice to ask if they needed anything more. Dee slid down off the stool. Her panties slipped up her rear, but she wasn't going to pick them right there in the restaurant. What she needed was some of that new underwear with a little line of silicone along the edges that stuck to the skin. These she had were pretty, but the lace edges slid all over. She'd fix them when she got out into the parking lot. Follow me out to my car, she said. I'll write you a check.